I'm going to show you the easiest way to carve a realistic barbarian out of your pumpkin. Now, I'm not going to go into every single pumpkin carving detail because there are tons of videos about that. I created this template that you can use to carve the pumpkin. The lightest places on the barbarian is where you're going to carve all the way through the pumpkin. The darkest spots are where you're not going to touch the pumpkin. You're just going to leave everything on. And then the parts in the middle that are shaded, those are parts where you're only going to carve halfway through. And there's one part that you'll only carve quarter of the way through the pumpkin, and I'll show you how to do all of that a little bit later. I also have one where it has some numbers on the guide showing where you're going to carve all the way through, where you're going to carve halfway and a quarter of the way through. It doesn't have every single piece, but it gives you an idea of which shades will show you how far to carve through the pumpkin. But if you want, you can screenshot this template, or I'll have a link in the description where you can download this template so you can print it out and put it on your pumpkin. So after you've gotten your template, you're going to need to get a few tools. First, you're going to need something to scoop out your pumpkin. This can be any type of spoon or anything, but all these tools I'm going to show you I got from a pumpkin carving set which cost about $5 or $6. So the things it had in it were this scooper. It had a big saw for cutting off the top of the pumpkin, some smaller saws for carving the pumpkin, and then this little hole puncher. You're also going to need some kind of knife, tape, and then obviously you'll need a big bucket or something to put all the insides of the pumpkin in. You're also going to need a couple more things which I'll show you later. So the first step, obviously, cut out the top of the pumpkin. Okay, pause the video real quick. After I did this, I realized that the best way to do this is not to carve off the top, it's actually to cut out the bottom instead. By cutting out the bottom, it'll make your pumpkin look seamless. Also, it's a lot easier to put a candle inside, light it, and then set the pumpkin on top of the candle. You can also flatten off the bottom that you cut off so the candle has a nice resting place to sit on. So when you do this, carve out the bottom, not the top like I'm doing here. Empty the entire pumpkin out and then put all that in the pot or bucket, and then once you have the pumpkin carved out, you're ready to tape your template on and start marking out where you're going to carve. You're going to print your template out. I would recommend doing it as big as possible because that way it'll be easier to carve in the smaller spaces. You're going to tape it onto your pumpkin. It might take quite a bit of tape to keep it on, but you want to then kind of form it to the shape of your pumpkin. The one thing I didn't show you you'll need is a tack or a pin or some little thing that you can poke holes into your pumpkin with. Basically, this next step is outlining everything in the template. You're going to outline the very outside of the barbarian. You're going to outline its eyes, its teeth, every different colored shape you see on the template you want to outline. This is so when you take the template off, you can see where you're going to need to carve out. So we're going to outline everything by poking holes through the template, and then we can remove the template after everything is poked. You do not want to remove the template until everything is done, because then if you try to put it back on, it's not going to line up perfectly. So after you've gotten all your holes poked, you want to get some kind of marker or the best thing to write on a pumpkin and basically connect all the dots that you've just poked in. You can use your paper template as a guide to mark all these lines, but basically you want to get the outline of everything, and then after I've gotten the outline, I just shaded in every place where I'm going to be carving all the way through the pumpkin. That way it's pretty easy for me to recognize which places I'm going all the way through and which places I'm only going halfway through. So now the first step in carving the pumpkin is carving all the places that go all the way through the pumpkin. Again, keep your paper template there as a guide so you can see exactly which places you're going to carve all the way through. So when you're carving these pieces all the way through the pumpkin, you want to make sure that the hole on the outside of the pumpkin is either the same size or smaller than the very inside of the pumpkin. So if you imagine carving these holes as cones through the pumpkin, you want the smaller part of the cone to be on the outside of the pumpkin so that the light will shine through the holes better. So I would highly recommend using some kind of a saw like I bought in this pumpkin carving kit rather than a knife. A saw is so much easier to control, and you can get in smaller spaces with these tiny saws. It is so much better than using a knife. And if you're able to buy a pumpkin carving set, they have some great tools for carving pumpkins. And I also used this hole puncher that came in the pumpkin carving set to punch out the pupils in the eyes, and that was very useful. But you don't have to have this specific puncher. You can just have anything that'll put a small hole in your pumpkin. Carving around the eyes was pretty tricky, and this will be the hardest part of this step, is going around the eyes, and the teeth are pretty tricky too because they're all so small. If you make some small mistakes, maybe you carve out too much, don't worry about it. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. I made tons of mistakes, and I'm I'm definitely not the best pumpkin carver, but it'll give you some forgiveness because when you put the candle in, it won't show every single little mistake. It'll kind of smooth it all out and you won't see these little mistakes that you've made. I carved out a couple parts that I wasn't supposed to carve out, but it turned out just fine. So after you're done carving all the parts that go all the way through, you want to carve out the parts that will go halfway through the pumpkin, and then there is one place you'll have to carve a quarter of the way through. The easiest way I found to do this is to use your saw to outline the places that you're going to be carving, but only carving halfway. You just want to make an outline so that it kind of gives you a guide for where you're going to be carving, and it will keep you from carving too far outside of those guidelines. So what I'm doing is just section by section. I'm starting with the head and I'm just carving halfway through the pumpkin and outline for where I'm going to be cutting through. I started out using a knife, but you will see in a minute a knife is not always the best choice. But I started out by using a knife. I would just shave it off layer by layer until I got down halfway. This may take a while, but just keep at it and keep going. Make sure you're not carving too far through. You just want to go halfway through. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect all the way around. You won't really see any mistakes that you made when you put your candle or light inside your pumpkin later. So just get about halfway through the pumpkin and then move on to the next section. Go through with your saw, carve about halfway down, and then keep shaving it off until you're halfway through. Now this is the point that I realized a knife was not the best tool for the job. Please be careful when you're carving a pumpkin with a knife. Try to keep your hands out of the way of the knife and don't hurt yourself. Please don't do what I did. And I actually continued to carve with a knife for a little bit until I remembered that I had this really cool tool that I bought in a different pumpkin carving set. Basically what you can do with this tool is shave off little by little, and it actually goes pretty quickly. And this is not dangerous at all because this thing is not sharp. It just has a thin enough metal edge that it's able to cut through the pumpkin. Now this isn't the perfect solution because there are places like little corners where this rounded part can't get into, so I did use the knife at some points. I also did use that little hole puncher to scrape out some little corners because it actually works really well for getting in corners. This is the part around the Barbarian's chin where you're only going to carve a quarter of the way through. Everything else you'll carve halfway through. This part you're just going to carve a quarter of the way through. You really only need to get off the skin and then a little bit under the skin and the light will shine through just fine. So carve that out a quarter of the way through. Make sure you're careful if you're using a knife, or use that really handy tool if you have one. And then around the eyes there are some places where you're going to be carving halfway through. Again, the eyes are the hardest part, I think, and just go really slow and take your time getting around that because the eyes are some of the most important places to get it right because we're naturally drawn to look at eyes, so everybody's going to be looking at the eyes when they look at the pumpkin. Again, for his hair over by his ear, I used this hole puncher to kind of scrape out because it was such a thin area, and that worked really well. Once you have all these places done, you've carved halfway through the pumpkin and you've carved all the way through the pumpkin in those certain areas. I took my pumpkin inside, turned off the lights, and put a candle inside to just check to see if I made any mistakes or I needed to clean anything up. And it looks like I need to clean out the eyes, clean out the teeth a little bit because I want the teeth to shine brighter, and maybe just clean everything up a little bit. So I brought the pumpkin back out, went ahead, cleaned up everything that I saw I needed to. You'll have different things you'll need to clean up, but I kind of went through and just shaved off parts that I didn't quite finish, cleaned up the eyes, cleaned up the teeth. Inside, I scraped it out again to get anything off that might have been blocking light from getting through. And then I went ahead and just rinsed out my pumpkin, tried to wash all the little bits off, and after that my pumpkin was pretty much done. So honestly, this pumpkin looks hideous. I honestly wasn't sure at this point if my pumpkin was gonna look good at all. Your pumpkin might look terrible, but once you put that light inside, it looks amazing. In the light with no candle inside of it, it looks terrible, but it actually turned out really good. I was pretty happy with it. Let me know if you have any questions down in the comments, and let me know if your pumpkin turned out good or bad. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope this was helpful. Make sure you click that subscribe button.